It is 11:02 in the morning on August 9th, 1945, and in the Urakami Valley on the northern edge of Nagasaki, a Catholic cathedral bell has just finished ringing. Below the bell tower, workers at the Mitsubishi armaments plant are filing back from a brief air raid warning, one that ended 20 minutes earlier with the all clear. Schoolchildren are walking home for their midday meal. A tram has just pulled away from a stop near the Urakami River. None of them can see the aircraft 10 kilometers above them, a lone American B-29 named Bockscar, circling for a final visual fix on a target it was never supposed to hit. Kokura, the primary target that morning, has been hidden by cloud and industrial haze for 3 passes running. Nagasaki is the reserve. At 2 minutes past 11, a bombardier named Kermit Beahan finds a gap in the clouds over the Mitsubishi steel works and releases a single weapon, 5 meters long, weighing just over 4.5 tons, codenamed Fat Man. 43 seconds later, at a height of about 500 meters above the valley, it detonates. In that instant, the temperature at the hypocentre climbs to several million degrees, briefly hotter than the surface of the sun. This is the story of a city that has spent 80 years standing in the shadow of another, of a weapon whose design was in some ways more sophisticated than the one that came before it, and of a tragedy that history has too often treated as a footnote. To understand why Nagasaki happened at all, you have to go back to the summer of 1945 and the impossible arithmetic facing Allied planners. Japan's government had not surrendered after the firebombing of 67 cities, after Tokyo burned in March with a death toll that may have exceeded that of either atomic bombing, after the loss of Iwo Jima and Okinawa at a combined cost of over 100,000 American and Japanese lives. Intelligence estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, varied wildly, but even conservative figures projected hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties and Japanese military and civilian losses that could have run into the millions. The Japanese War Ministry had, by mid-1945, mobilized a civilian militia numbering in the tens of millions, armed in some cases with little more than sharpened bamboo spears, with instructions to resist to the last. 3 days earlier, on August 6th, Hiroshima had been destroyed by a uranium gun-type weapon named Little Boy, and still Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of the War remained deadlocked, 3 members favoring surrender, 3 favoring continued resistance. Soviet forces had crossed into Manchuria on August 8th, shattering any hope that Moscow might broker a negotiated peace. American planners, working from an assumption that a demonstration of overwhelming and repeatable destructive power was the only language that would break the deadlock in Tokyo, had always intended more than one bomb. What existing solutions had failed to achieve was simple and brutal. Nothing so far, not conventional bombing on an unprecedented scale, not the loss of entire island garrisons, had persuaded the Japanese High Command to accept unconditional surrender. The challenge facing Washington was to end a war that seemed, from the ground, unendable. The weapon built to help answer that challenge was assembled at Los Alamos, New Mexico, under the direction of physicist Robert Oppenheimer, and it represented a fundamentally different engineering problem from the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Where Little Boy relied on a comparatively simple method, firing one mass of uranium-235 into another inside a gun barrel to achieve a critical mass, the plutonium at the heart of Fat Man could not be used the same way. Plutonium-239 has a habit of triggering itself prematurely if compressed too slowly, a problem that had stalled the entire plutonium weapons program for the best part of a year. The solution devised at Los Alamos and tested for the first time at the Trinity site in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, was implosion, a spherical arrangement of conventional high-explosive lenses, detonated with such precision that the shock waves arrived at the plutonium core within a fraction of a microsecond of one another, crushing it symmetrically to roughly twice its normal density. Getting that timing wrong by even a whisker would have produced a partial, far less powerful and far less useful explosion. It was, by the standards of 1945 engineering, an extraordinary feat of applied physics, requiring the invention of new kinds of detonators and new mathematics to model shock compression, much of it worked out by hand and with mechanical calculators. The bomb itself, at just over 3 meters long and 1.5 meters in diameter, earned its nickname from its bulbous, ungainly shape, a far cry from the sleek cylinder of Little Boy. Its explosive yield at Nagasaki is generally put at around 21 kilotons of TNT equivalent, close to 40% more powerful than the bomb that had leveled Hiroshima, though because of Nagasaki's hillier terrain, which channeled and partly contained the blast within the Urakami Valley, the destruction, while still catastrophic, covered a smaller area than in the flatter city to the south. Production of the plutonium itself took place at the sprawling Hanford site in Washington state, where nuclear reactors run by the DuPont Company had been converted, almost overnight in industrial terms, from a peacetime chemical firm's expertise into a facility producing a material that had barely existed in gram quantities 2 years earlier. Exact figures on how much plutonium existed in the American arsenal by August 1945 remain, even today, incompletely declassified, but historians generally agree that only a small number of additional cores were available or in production, meaning Nagasaki was not simply a demonstration of unlimited capacity. It may, in fact, have been closer to the limit of what the program could deliver that summer than official statements at the time suggested. The bombing of Nagasaki itself has never carried the same cultural weight as Hiroshima, and the reasons are almost as revealing as the event itself. Nagasaki was not the primary target. Kokura, an arsenal city further north, was meant to receive the second bomb, and was saved that day by nothing more than cloud cover and smoke drifting from a conventional firebombing raid on the nearby city of Yahata the previous day, an accident of weather now sometimes referred to as Kokura's luck. Nagasaki's own history compounds the sense of a place struck almost by chance. It was a city with a centuries-old Christian community dating back to Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century, and the bomb detonated almost directly above the Urakami Cathedral, at the time the largest Catholic church in East Asia, killing an estimated 8,000 of the parish's roughly 12,000 members. Estimates of the total death toll by the end of 1945 range from about 40,000 to 70,000, with a further rise over subsequent years and decades from radiation-related illness bringing some estimates closer to 80,000. Because the hills surrounding the Mitsubishi works absorbed and redirected much of the blast, some residential districts only a kilometer or two away were spared the near-total destruction seen in Hiroshima, an accident of geography that has sometimes, in the decades since, led to Nagasaki being discussed as though it were the lesser of the two tragedies. Survivors, known in Japanese as hibakusha, describe scenes that written testimony still struggles to convey. A wall of heat that ignited clothing and wooden buildings at a distance of several kilometers, a black rain that fell an hour later carrying radioactive fallout that contaminated water supplies far beyond the immediate blast zone, and a silence in the immediate aftermath broken only, as several survivors have recorded, by the sound of falling roof tiles and distant fires. If you are finding this account of Nagasaki's story worth your time, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think and costs you nothing. Compared with the German nuclear program, the American achievement at Los Alamos looks even more remarkable, if only by the scale of its rival's failure. Germany's own uranium research, led loosely by physicist Werner Heisenberg among others, remained fragmented across competing institutes, chronically short of the heavy water needed to moderate a reactor after Allied and Norwegian resistant sabotage crippled the Vemork plant in occupied Norway, and never progressed beyond small experimental reactor assemblies that failed to achieve a sustained chain reaction before the war's end. Some historians have argued the German effort was slowed further by an early miscalculation of the critical mass required, one that made a workable bomb seem far more distant than it actually was. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was closer than either the German or Japanese programs, aided substantially by espionage that funneled details of the American implosion design east through networks including the physicist Klaus Fuchs, though Moscow would not test its own device until 1949. Japan had its own limited nuclear research, centered on the Riken Institute under physicist Yoshio Nishina, but lacked the industrial capacity, the uranium supply, and by 1945, the intact infrastructure to pursue anything beyond preliminary study. What set the American program apart was not any single scientific insight so much as its scale. Roughly 130,000 people were employed across the Manhattan Project's sites at its peak, and its total cost, in the region of $2 billion at 1945 prices, was a commitment of industrial and financial resources no other combatant nation could have matched while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts. The legacy of Nagasaki is harder to weigh than its immediate destruction, precisely because so much of its effect was psychological rather than purely material. Whether the bombing was decisive in ending the war, or whether the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria on August 8th played the larger role in breaking the deadlock in Tokyo, remains genuinely and seriously contested among historians, and this account does not claim to settle it. What can be said is that on August 15th, 6 days after Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, ending the deadliest conflict in human history. The bomb's technical legacy proved longer-lasting than any single argument about causation. The implosion design pioneered for Fat Man became the template for nearly every fission weapon built since, and the vast industrial infrastructure created at Hanford and elsewhere seeded the nuclear arms race that would define the following 4.5 decades of Cold War tension. In Nagasaki itself, the Atomic Bomb Museum and the ruins of a single torii gate left standing near the destroyed Sano Shrine, its second pillar and roof beam sheared away by the blast, stand today as some of the few physical remnants of that morning, alongside the rebuilt Urakami Cathedral, whose bell tower, blown from its foundations, still lies where it fell as a memorial. The city's hibakusha, a dwindling number now in their 80s and 90s, have spent decades giving testimony specifically because, as many of them have said in interviews recorded for Nagasaki's Peace Memorial archives, they fear Hiroshima's fame has allowed the world to treat their city's suffering as an afterthought, a historical footnote to an event that had, in truth, already happened 3 days before. Return for a moment to that morning above the Urakami Valley, a cathedral bell falling silent, a tram pulling away from its stop, a city that was never meant to be the target at all. Nagasaki was struck not because it was chosen first, but because Kokura was obscured by smoke, and Bockscar was running low on fuel, and history turned on that accident of weather as surely as it turned on the physics worked out in the New Mexico desert 3 weeks earlier. What was achieved that day, in the narrowest technical sense, was a demonstration that implosion, an idea considered so unreliable a year earlier that it had nearly been abandoned, could be engineered with enough precision to work exactly once, in exactly the conditions required, over exactly the right city. What was achieved in the broader sense is a question that has occupied historians for 80 years, and will likely occupy them for 80 more. Whether this second bombing, coming so soon after the first, was necessary to end the war, or whether it was a tragedy compounded upon a tragedy, a second demonstration where one had perhaps already been enough. Somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people did not live to see the war's end 6 days later. A cathedral that had stood for the better part of 30 years became rubble in an instant, and a Christian community with 4 centuries of history in Japan lost 2/3 of its congregation in a single flash of light. Nagasaki is not the forgotten twin of Hiroshima because its suffering was smaller. It is forgotten because it came second, because geography spared some of its streets, and because the world, having already absorbed the shock of one atomic city, found it harder to absorb the shock of a second. 80 years on, the torii gate at Sano Shrine still stands with half its structure gone, a single pillar holding up what remains of a roof that should never have needed to bear such weight. It stands, as Nagasaki itself has stood, as proof that some tragedies do not require to be first in order to be remembered. They only require, at last, to be told.